happened afterwards. So the singer Ledbetter writes this song about the situation, the Scottsboro Nine, but then afterwards leaves this piece of advice for fellow African Americans. I advise everybody, he says, be a little careful when they go along there, that is to Scottsboro, Alabama. Be careful when you go along there. Best stay woke, keep their eyes open. Be careful, be alert, or this could happen to you too. Since then, this kind of wise advice to stay on your guard and alert, given the racial tensions and injustices in the States, actually became a political slogan, particularly in the 60s and the 70s. Although more recently, the soul singer Erykah Badu is probably the person who brought it back into the popular consciousness. Trish and I were talking about, we're both big Erykah Badu fans. We're talking about some of her seminal albums before, but she has a song on one of her early 2000s albums called Master Teacher, where she advises or raises this idea of we stay woke. So the original meaning, if you like, I'm going to call it woke one, is this idea of being alive to or alert, aware of racial injustice, particularly in North America. And it was the murder of an unarmed man, Michael Brown, a teenager, by police in Ferguson in 2014 that really sparked some of this movement off again. Some intense protests, the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement around this time, really highlighting the issue of police violence, shootings of African Americans. And the hashtag Stay Woke, came into worldwide attention, first on Black Twitter, and then moving into more mainstream white millennials and Gen Zs picked it up as a sign of solidarity or understanding of these progressive causes. So the Stay Woke hashtag becomes a movement. And not just a movement around racial equality, although that always was center of it. It also became kind of a banner for a bunch of other social issues to be hung on. Issues about other oppressed groups within society or marginalized groups in society. Issues ranging from sexism to gay rights, same-sex marriage, right through to trans identities, etc. So if you like, we could define woke too, in this era, as being fighting or a campaign for social justice in general. All sorts of different categories, from racial to sex identities. Now, sociologists tell us that wokeness as a popular culture thing has actually been and gone. Right? It's on the decline, it's peaked. The Economist newspaper tracks the use of woke terms in corporate publications and newspaper articles. It peaked in 21 and 22 and has been on the decline since. So in some ways, it has moved out of the popular consciousness. But in the mid-2020s, we see kind of a new life for the term, a revival of the term, but used by the opponents of socially progressive movements. People have used the woke movement, the term woke, actually to mock people on the left with progressive causes. So that soul singer Erykah Badu actually was interviewed recently and said the term doesn't belong to us anymore. It's taken on a life of its own as an insult. If you want to define this as woke 3, means something like extreme left-wing or socially progressive ideas that I disagree with. Okay, it's a term of critique. It's a term even of insult. People under this will often be describing left-leaning proposals like corporate diversity, equity, inclusion policies, those kind of quotas that HR departments might have to hire people from particular identities or minority groups. We might be thinking of cancel culture, where people are publicly called out and vilified on social media or even targeted in their workplace because of opinions that they have. This is the idea that words themselves are violence, and so extreme means are necessary to cancel them. You might be thinking of pressure in your workplace or your school to take part in symbolic or performative acts of support, like changing our Instagram profiles to a black square, and if you don't do that, then you must be against social justice, or maybe putting pronouns at the end of your email footer. We might even associate this with some extreme forms of gender ideology. Not just pronouns in the email footer, but perhaps campaigns or school education programs in primary and secondary schools teaching trans ideology, a radical approach to gender. And so this is the third woke, if you like. Woke 3, we might call a commitment to radical social reform. Now, I want to be really careful, particularly with this third one, because it's important to acknowledge that no one calls themselves woke in that sense. Right? This is not a label which people apply to themselves anymore. Just like no one would put fascist on their Bumble profile, no one's going to put woke there because it is a term of abuse. It is a term of critique. But I do want to acknowledge also that when conservative critics use this term, they're describing a movement that does seem to have an ideological coherence. It's often a Marxist or a critical theory kind of perspective, which seeks to address social issues, but in a radical way. And that term radical is important. We'll come back to that in a second. What do we mean by a radical approach to these social problems? Well, through the lens of critical theory, which is a way of looking at the world which was sort of came from academia, but then, like many things, has kind of filtered down into our everyday society. Through the lens of critical theory, a police shooting of an unarmed black person is not an isolated tragedy. It illustrates, according to critical theory, the fact that society itself is structurally racist. A sexist joke in the office is not just one person's bad taste, but actually illustrates that our society as a whole is structurally sexist. And the thing is, if you have structural problems in your home or building, you don't just sort of like plaster over it, do you? If something is structurally broken, you need radical repair. In fact, you need to tear the whole thing down. If our system of law enforcement is structurally racist, it's not just one or two bad eggs, but actually the whole thing is racist, then it's not enough just to screen recruits better or have better training and policies. We actually need to defund the police, abolish policing. Or if our whole society is built on the back of economic oppression, then we don't need charity. Charity is part of the problem. It's a band-aid solution. In fact, we need to tear the whole thing down and end capitalism. Likewise, if our whole society is sexist, then we need to dismantle the patriarchy or even deconstruct the idea that there are two genders in the first place. Now, I really struggled with this topic because people can mean all of these different things, woke 1, woke 2, or woke 3, when they're talking about the topic. And so it's really important that we slow down and ask what people mean before we enter into it. But I don't know what people meant when they asked this question. My assumption is that they're thinking more about that current cultural movement, the critical theory, the Marxist kind of stuff within society. So I'm going to focus on woke 3, if you like, this commitment to radical social reform, and ask the question, how should Christians respond to this movement? And I think the answer to that really is quite simple. Like anything that Christians respond to in society, in culture, like how do Christians respond to culture? Well, not by being for or against it. Right? It's not that simple. Because we are Christians first. We're not unthinkingly for society or uncritically against. Rather, we want to bring everything back to Jesus and the Bible, don't we? We want to be testing everything against what Jesus teaches us. And we can hold on to the good, and we can part ways and acknowledge the differences and then show people Jesus. That's what I'm going to try to do today. We're going to look firstly at what points in critical theory or the woke movement does the Bible give a big thumbs up to? What parts can we affirm? Where as Christians might we have to part ways? And then finally, how does the gospel actually offer us more and a better hope? So firstly, what can we affirm? Well, as Christians, we're actually going to end up affirming probably a lot of things within the woke movement, particularly the concern for justice, the concern for people, and that people are treated right, even if we don't always agree with everything that they say and do. For example, let's go back to those black squares on Instagram on the 2nd of June 2020, when people on Instagram in a coordinated political movement posted just simply black squares to Instagram. This was designed to highlight the shocking murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. He was murdered by a police officer, and the history of racial injustice that brought up in that city. How should Christians respond to something like this? Well, firstly, we want to wholeheartedly affirm the image of God in all people. We affirm the image of God in all people. As Christians, we are against murder. Exodus chapter 20, verse 13. You shall do no murder. But more than that, we also believe that all people of every tribe, of every language, and every culture are made in God's image and their lives matter to Him. Genesis chapter 9, verse 6. Furthermore, as Christians, we believe all authorities, including the police force in Minneapolis, are accountable to God to do what is just and what is right. And that those who abuse that power, it's a very hard job, but those who abuse that power will be held to account by God. They will be judged by God. Jeremiah chapter 22. So there's lots that we can affirm in this kind of movement. And I want to be so bold at this point, maybe controversially, to suggest that Christians will often find themselves agreeing with these bits of critical theory or critical race theory, these kind of movements, because actually at their core, these Marxist and critical theory ideologies have borrowed a lot from the gospel. It's not that Jesus read Marx, it's the other way around. A lot of these movements borrow Christian theological ideas, like that all people are valuable because they're in the image of God. Now, they don't have the same belief in God behind it, but they are Christian ideas. The idea that people have intrinsic worth and value is a deeply biblical idea. And so therefore, we will affirm that. We'll also join probably in lamenting oppression and injustice. We lament oppression and injustice. Right, to recognize that oppression is evil and oppose it is not a left-leaning thing or a right-leaning thing. It's just a godly thing. Proverbs chapter 17, whoever mocks the poor shows contempt for their maker. Whoever gloats over disaster will not go unpunished. As Christians, we lament any situation, doesn't matter where it's happening, any situation where a human being is treated less than the image of God. So when anyone on the left or on the right, brings up an example of injustice, whether we agree with them on everything or not, we are absolutely going to be weeping with those who weep. Romans chapter 12, verse 15. A friend of mine in this church, I talked to her this week. She works in a very progressive, not-for-profit environment, and she had this great advice for how she navigates this at work. I'll call her Anna. It's undeniable that there's plenty in social justice realm that's badly designed or poorly thought through. In any flavour of secular thought, left, right, or centrist, there will always be things that Christians can't fully affirm. I think it's helpful as Christians running up against woke sentiment and initiatives to consider if there's a positive intent or elements we can affirm. For example, even if anti-homophobia-focused initiative frames things around sexual identity in a way that we can't fully get on board with, is there a motivation, she asks, of making sure no one is subject to bullying that we can affirm? We are, after all, people who believe in treating others how we'd want to be treated. I think it's great advice. As Christians, we should absolutely be against sin, right? As Christians, we are against sin. And so in your workplace, please make sure that you are someone who is known as being against racist, sexist jokes. You should be someone who is known for actively standing up against disrespect and harassment. Not because you're woke, not because you're left, not because you're right, but because you're a Christian. And because doing unto others as you'd have do to you is Jesus' teaching. So we will lament the real injustices that critical theory highlights. And where we have some responsibility for that, we may even repent of our sin. As Christians, we're used to repenting. Right? We repent all the time. And sometimes people are going to show us things that we are accountable for, or responsible for, that we need to acknowledge that we've done wrong. Now, I understand that it can get tricky here and possibly controversial. We can talk about this. When we're talking about injustices that relate to groups that we're a part of, that's a little bit more complicated. We know from Ezekiel 18 that no one is held or no one is punished because of the sins of their fathers. So we do understand that there's individual responsibility and punishment. But at the same time, in the Bible, we also see that groups of people can repent of their group sin. such as in Daniel chapter 9, when Daniel repents for the sins on behalf of the nation. Now, here in Australia, we don't have the same history of black slavery, legalized slavery that they do in the United States. Our issues are different, but 5 minutes in our history books will show us that there are some things in our past that we should not only lament, but probably repent of. Peter Adam is a former principal of Ridley College. I'm pretty sure he's the least woke person I know, actually. He told me that when he was a kid, this is for real, he used to ride a horse to school. All right? So he's not who you would imagine as a raving leftist. But he does know our history, and he knows the Bible. And he puts it very bluntly. Australia today is based on theft of land. Old sins cast long shadows. Now, you don't have to be a Marxist to think that murdering people and taking their land is wrong. So as a Christian, I'm going to want to affirm that these injustices being highlighted are real. I want to lament with the people who are living with the fallout, the long shadow of these sins. And maybe repent of my or our role in that sin. Now, if highlighting injustice and lamenting injustice was all that there was to this issue, then it would probably be a very short and simple sermon. I could sit down now. But depending on the issue and the person that you're talking with, sometimes what's behind this, we will actually need to part ways with. So that brings us to the next part, which is where do we part ways? Where do we part ways with critical theory or with Marxism or the woke three that I was talking about? Because these include ideologies. Beyond just identifying injustice, there are ideologies behind them that are radical and are offering radical or extreme solutions. Remember, if society is not just got a problem, but society is structurally rotten, then you're going to be looking for radical solutions. Tear the whole place down. And the biblical view would part company with some of these radical solutions and that ideologies. Here's why. Here's one place that we part company, an obvious place. We believe in God, firstly. And these ideologies are not just often atheist, they are antagonistic towards God and faith and religion. Right? Marxist and critical theories are almost always atheist in outlook and openly hostile to religion. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't work with them. We've just got to acknowledge that we're coming from a different place with different values. And at some point, we may have to part company. For instance, second thing, we don't throw away the good in creation because we believe in a creator. Now, critical theorists argue that society is so structurally sexist, racist, and oppressive that we need to kind of abolish the whole thing, but in the process end up throwing out some of the good things in creation. They go too far. They deny things that we as Christians would see as not human corruption, but actually the good in creation, the good in God's good creation. One example, just to pick one. There's a contemporary feminist writer, philosopher called Sophie Lewis, who argues that because so many of our problems and inequalities are to do with family, we actually need a rather radical solution to that problem. She writes, no one is likelier to rob, bully, blackmail, manipulate, or hit you, or inflict unwanted touch than family, right? Family is problematic. Together then, she goes on, we can establish consensus-based modes of transgenerational cohabitation and large-scale methods for distributing and minimizing the burdens of life's work. What does that mean? Well, the clue is in the title of the book, Abolish the Family. Abolish the Family, a manifesto for care and liberation. What's she saying? Well, she's saying that if society is so sexist, then the only way to address sexism and inequality is not just to tweak around the edges. You have to take away the whole structure that's causing the damage. You have to abolish the nuclear family. Now, you might feel like this is extreme or a fringe view, but actually the idea of abolishing the nuclear family is an old argument. It goes all the way back to Engels and Marx. And as Christians, we're just going to need to part ways on this point, because we believe that the family is something good that God created. It's not a human invention that we can abandon at will. When asked about this, Jesus said, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? Male and female are part of the original design. and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Jesus is quoting Genesis here. And he goes on, so they are no longer two but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. And so we see that in the effort to address injustices, and often real injustices, critical theorists go so far that they actually throw out some good things. Some good things in creation, like marriage, like male and female, like family. That's not to deny that there are problems. Right? The Bible is very real about the sin that has infected every part of society, but also we believe that there is a good design underneath that we need to preserve. Now, of course, critical theory does this because they don't believe in God, they don't believe in a creator, they don't have the Bible to understand what's good and what's human sin. As Christians, we do, and so we're going to want to resist the temptation to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Now, does this mean that everyone who advocates for better treatment of women and girls is trying to abolish the family? No, of course not. But we just need to be aware that there's a full spectrum of views, and behind a lot of these seemingly or soundingly good ideas is a radical vision for a new society that we will need to part company with at some point. That's why it's so important actually to ask people what they mean. And actually say, hey, that label, that banner, can we just get beyond that and ask, what do you mean by that? What does that mean to you? And what are you looking for? Between woke 1, woke 2, and woke 3, there's going to be a huge variety in the people that we deal with. But that's not to deny that there are strong cultural currents generally. I know in this city, Melbourne, a lot of energy from the radical end of the spectrum has gone into the education system. Why? Why the focus on primary and secondary schools? Well, I have progressive friends who are telling me that what they're trying to do is explicitly to get between parents and their children, to actually change the way that children are raised, because they see that as the biggest obstacle to equality and justice. And to them, the influence that parents have over their children is part of the problem. That's why the huge investment in schools and education. Now, radical ideas like this do have an impact. And we see it particularly in schools, as I mentioned, but also online. That other place where young, still forming people are exposed to the attitudes and ideas away from their parental input. So we need to just be alert and aware that these ideas have consequences. Particularly on social media, by the way, which amplifies the extremes. It amplifies the extremes and the uncompromising views. In contrast, as Christians, this is the other thing, we don't think the world is simple. As Christians, we don't believe the world is that simple. One of the big debates in, woke versus conservative ideologies at the moment is whether individuals are responsible for what happens to them, for their prosperity in life, or whether broader social injustice is the thing. Do we live in a meritocracy where hard work pays off? Or is everyone's success based on the oppression of others? Should we teach our children that hard work and resilience is the way to make a way through life? Or should we teach them that they are either victims or oppressors? Well, we discovered, didn't we, when we did our series at church on Proverbs, that the answer is, well, both. Proverbs chapter 10, verse 4, lazy hands make for poverty, but diligent hands bring wealth. That's true. But also Proverbs 13:23, an unplowed field produces food for the poor, but injustice sweeps it away. The world is complex. Hard work often pays off, but sometimes it doesn't because there's injustice in the world. And the wisdom of the Bible is that it's complicated. There is no simple answer. And the extreme or simple answers of critical theory, I think, are attractive for a lot of people because they're so simple. Life is hard, the world is complex, and here you have people holding out a very black and white view of the world. Your problems are all the result of oppression. That's simple. The problem is if you start addressing complex problems with simple answers, history tells you you're probably going to create more problems. So the Bible here is vitally important. It is wisdom for us because it trains us to reject this kind of simplistic thinking. For example, as Christians, we don't divide the world into victims and oppressors, do we? Now, critical theory encourages us to do this, to group everyone in this room into their group based on their major identity, whatever it is. Whether that's according to sex or ethnic identity, sexual identity, political affiliation, or generation, like age. And then on that basis, to kind of put us in a hierarchy. Some groups are the oppressors, some are the victims. Now, judging people you don't know based on superficial membership of a group is a really bad idea. Because you're probably going to dehumanize that person. It's much easier to hate someone you know nothing about. And it's dangerous. If I start treating you not as a person, but as a white person or a black person, a lefty or a fascist, a boomer or a millennial, it's a very, very easy thing to fall into, to start treating that person with hatred and contempt. But the world is just not full of heroes and villains. We are complicated people, all of us. And if we act based on these simple dichotomies, then we're probably going to cause more hate and injustice, not solve any problems. In contrast, the Bible celebrates God's work bringing justice and liberation to the oppressed, but it also reminds us that we are all capable of being both. Right, in Exodus chapter 1, God rescues his people from the Egyptian oppressors. They're in slavery in Egypt. He rescues them from oppression. But did you know back in Genesis 16, Abraham and Sarah oppressed their Egyptian slave? So what are we, heroes or villains? The Bible says you are both. Dividing the world neatly into heroes and villains, oppressors and victims is always going to fail because the world is complex. For we have all made the charge, for we've already made the charge, writes Paul, that Jews and Gentiles alike are all under the power of sin. As it is written, there is no one righteous, not even one. Romans chapter 3. Rather than divide the world into oppressors and victims, the Bible confronts us with the truth that we have all sinned and fallen short of God's glory. So there's much that we can affirm in the woke movement. There's also much that we must part company over. And in doing so, I want to just encourage us to keep coming back to Jesus, because what Jesus offers is so much better. It is good news. This is where we get onto what the gospel offers that's so much more. Firstly, critical theorists often sound like fire and brimstone preachers, right? It is merciless, denouncing sinners, but without any hope of redemption. There's no hope. Whereas we believe that Jesus, yes, he confronts us with our sin, but he doesn't cancel us. He offers forgiveness and reconciliation and redemption. I know a chaplain who spent some time with the parents of a boy who had been cancelled on social media for views that he expressed. His entire school called him out. He was rejected by all his friends. They worried that he would never be able to get a job. Now, these were not Christian parents, but they said something to the chaplain which was incredible. They said, "Where is the possibility of redemption in this culture?" Though not Christians, these parents were actually reaching for the gospel. Yes, there is sin, but there is also hope. The gospel is good news because God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. The gospel is a message of reconciliation, not just between us and God, but between us and each other. I don't have time, but I would love to share some of the stories that I've seen in even our church of people being reconciled to each other. Men and women from different languages and backgrounds reconciled to each other and to God. The gospel is good news. And the gospel gives us hope because Jesus is in charge, not us. We have a vision of him who is seated on the throne saying, "Behold, I am making all things new." We can be aware of social injustice. We can be working for justice in this world. But we can also rest knowing that Jesus is ultimately working and in control. I spoke with Rachel, who's in our church. Rachel works very hard for justice as an immigration lawyer. She shared with me this week the difference between her and her colleagues that this gospel makes. She says, "I don't have to engage with the news cycle 24/7. I don't need to constantly be on social media, like consuming quite horrific images and things like that. I can rest," she says, "not because I've disengaged, but because I trust that God is in control. And finally, the gospel empowers us to respond in these discussions with grace. We have whole generations now who've been discipled by the internet to ramp up the temperature, to escalate everything. And the anonymity of the internet encourages us to forget the humanity of the people we're engaging with. Another friend here at church, Ben, has this sound advice for us as Christians. Labels, he says, like woke or MAGA, strip away nuance and reduce people to categories instead of recognizing their humanity and responsibility. A more Christ-like approach is to see each person as made in the image of God and take time to understand their unique beliefs and values. That's good advice. So how do we approach the woke movement? Well, firstly, by asking, what do you mean by it? What does this mean to you? Secondly, as Christians, we will affirm much of what we see, but also part ways where we must. And always be holding out the truth, the beauty, the relevance of Jesus, who is so much better than anything else the world can offer. Now, there's no doubt a couple of questions. I'm going to get Britt up in a second, but have a stand, have a stretch, think of some questions that you might discuss in gospel community this week or now. We're going to come back in a moment and hopefully deal with some of these questions together. Thank you so much.
Lots of fruitful discussions by the sounds of it. Let's get straight into our questions, starting with question number 1.
I've often wondered this.
I was like, from file user... Okay, I was going to give it a go. Good thing I have a backup plan. Okay, question number 1. Okay, I'm just going to go with this. Yeah, let's listen to me. Okay, sorry, this has really stressed me out. How are we going to respond to the most prominent anti-woke Christian movements, in particular Christian nationalism? What do they get right and what do they get wrong?
Sorry, just because I can't see, I read it. Can you say it for me again?
Yes, I sure can.
So I answer this.
All right. How are we to respond to the most prominent anti-woke Christian movements, in particular Christian nationalism? What do they get right? What do they get wrong?
If my understanding is correct, in Christian nationalism, we see a sort of inextricable linking between religion and politics, and so they become very intertwined. And I think what can be tricky in it is this idea that what is the vehicle or the means by which we're going to see the world redeemed or renewed or Christ's purposes kind of played out. And one thing that is, and so you sort of, they become, so it becomes very much an attaching of political ideas and religious ideas all meshed into one, and a strong allegiance to a political party. And what's difficult there is that I think as Christians, we are called to be gospel people. It says, or you might have even heard the term evangelical, which is a very loaded term, very complex term, but it comes from the word for gospel. And so I was reading someone much smarter than I, and they were talking about how, so at our heart, our allegiance is to the gospel, right? First and foremost, which means that actually, perhaps as we engage in citizens of the world, where we lean politically might actually change. Because you know what? This is what I'm committed to first and foremost is Jesus. And what I'm trusting in as the vehicle that's going to bring renewal and redemption and change is the gospel. And I think it's very clear in the Bible that God's plan for reaching the world is through his people, the church. And so I'm not saying therefore the church becomes this mega powerful, but it's this idea of, you know what, I am going to trust in the church to be salt and to be light, not therefore putting my identity first and foremost in a political movement or a political party to be the salt, the light. Andy, what thoughts?
No, absolutely, totally agree with it. Like, we do exactly the same thing that we did in that sermon with the woke movement, just for any social movement. Where can we affirm what's in the Bible? Where do we have to part company? Because the thing about the reactionary anti-woke movement is if you do the opposite of everything the people on the left are doing, that doesn't make it, you end up with just opposite problems. So we just want to be really respectful and engage with well, what does this mean to you? What do you think the issues are? And bring it back to the Bible. And hopefully if they're Christian, you're actually going to have more luck having a discussion because we share that common basis in the Bible. We don't want to be reactionary. We don't want to kind of just run the other direction because of a movement we disagree with. We want to be really selective and just go through that process. What can we affirm? Where do we have to part company? Where does the gospel give us hope? And I think that's a great, And, we might surprise ourselves and actually end up on different sides of a political spectrum on different issues.
10 points for both of you. I'm very satisfied with that answer. And hopefully if you asked that question, I would be like, damn, that answered my question. Tick. Big tick. Question number 2. Hopefully it's a real question. Here we go. Is affirming God's love for all people in God's image enough? Sometimes this can diminish genuine struggles of minority groups. How can we lovingly affirm equity over equality? Do we need to?
Yeah, great question. So, I think it comes back to listening. So one of the great insights of critical theory is this kind of idea called standpoint theory. So Charlie Mills, who's a Jamaican philosopher, talks about how basically if you want to understand the world, if you want to understand your company, don't ask the CEO what working conditions are like. Ask the person at the bottom of the org chart because they often have a deeper insight into how the society really works. And I think that's a great insight. As Christians, I've used that. You just talk to people. Hey, what is it like being a minority within this particular culture? And I think that kind of curiosity is something that we can definitely take on board, even if we don't adopt the same solutions or simple answers that maybe critical theory offers. I think it's a good kind of attitude to have. And I absolutely wouldn't want to stop at just saying, everyone's in God's image, because there are particular problems that particular people face that we need to understand before we can even start to address. So I think lovingly affirm equity over equality. I think it just comes down to listening to people and to having a heart for people and understanding that their experience might not be the same as ours.
Another amazing answer.
Are we going to get live ratings?
I know, I'm like, oh my gosh, guys, this is amazing. Keep going. One more question. Let's keep it going. No pressure, guys. Final question. How do we as Christians navigate Welcome to Country and Indigenous sermons that are quite spiritual and not in line with Christianity? Hot potato over here. Who wants it? Britt's like, okay.
Yeah, this is a great question, something I've thought a bit about. And I think the best answer of how to navigate this as a Christian is talk to the many, many, many Indigenous Christians who are leading in this country. I don't think people realise that, but if you're an Indigenous Australian, you're much more likely to be a Christian than anyone else. Right? It's actually a huge number of Christians within the Indigenous community, and they will have a better insight to this than me. So I talk to a student who's an Indigenous Christian and ask him, hey, what's good here and what do we need to be careful about? And he can kind of tell me in a way that has a deep understanding of the cultural practice, but also his theology is rock solid. And so I think by listening to Indigenous Christians is the short answer, and be discerning about what things mean. Asking what stuff means is a really good attitude to have. But yeah, I personally have no problem with welcome to country, most welcome to country events that I've seen, but I've also appreciated and seen very Christian ones which acknowledge God's sovereignty and pray for gospel blessings on Indigenous people. So yeah, I think we can, just by listening to Indigenous Christians is probably the best way through this, Spirit.
Yeah, that is really helpful. I remember we did not too long ago a series called Left and Right, and there was, which, if you were here, you probably remember it. But there was an interview, I think about week 3 of the series. We did race relations, and Guy did an interview with, and her name has. But she was wonderful. And if you go and look at that, an Indigenous woman, Brooke Prentice. I'm aware this is being recorded and stuff, but I don't want to say the wrong name. Brooke Prentice, and I really appreciated her insights. And there was things there that I learnt. A few things which you just outlined there. And so, all to say, I just don't think I could do that question justice in 10 more seconds. But if you are interested, that's a resource you could go and have a look at.
3 from 3. Very happy with those answers. 10 out of 10. Can we get a round of applause? Yeah.
That's great. That's great.
Well done, guys. Alrighty. We are going to praise God together before we break for community. So let's rise to our feet as we sing.